Hi, Founder fans. Jason here, and today's founder is John Brown Cutting. John Brown Cutting, considering his status in South Carolina society, is actually a very hard character to find things about his early life on. What we do know is that in his early 20s, he joins the Revolutionary War. And he becomes an assistant apothecary general in the Middle Department of the Continental Army. So pretty much what we would consider the mid-Atlantic of the East Coast nowadays. John Brown Cutting becomes an assistant apothecary general, and apothecaries at the time are essentially what we would consider pharmacists today. And as an assistant general, that's a pretty important position. Now, Cutting never seems to have any medical training. But he does go by the title doctor for the rest of his life, and it seems to be as this brief stint working as an assistant apothecary general where he feels the ability to carry that title. Again, this is a time where pretty much anyone could just go call themselves a doctor and be a doctor. So let's not be too hard on him. After the war concludes, Dr. Cutting does not want to be a physician. He actually wants to be a lawyer, and he travels to London where he studies law, becomes a lawyer, and while he's overseas, he becomes friendly with many other Americans serving overseas, notably Thomas Jefferson, William Short, and a gentleman named John Adams. You might recognize the name John Adams. He would be president one day. At this point, Adams travels to the Netherlands to negotiate financial support from the Dutch. He travels with John Brown Cutting, and John Brown Cutting actually serves as his secretary, John Adams' secretary, on a temporary basis for a few months. Now, this is despite Cutting's a little bit of a reputation for being a gossip. Thomas Jefferson never said that he thought Cutting would go out and just spread the news of American diplomacy to people who shouldn't hear it. But he did think Cutting might use some of his insider knowledge to impress some of the ladies. That's me trying to... Anyway, he thought he might use his insider knowledge to try and impress ladies, and that might get word out. That's probably why Cutting never really gets a diplomatic position. He only serves as a secretary for a little while. But he actually then gets recruited by the Prince of Luxembourg. Now, we don't talk about Luxembourg very frequently at all during the American Revolution, but they did help in one significant way. You see, if we travel back to when the war was still going on, South Carolina sends its Commodore Alexander Gillian to lease a ship from the Prince of Luxembourg. Again, much like each colony and then state had their own militias, many, not all, but many of the states had their own navy. And South Carolina had Alexander Gillian, who was actually a very important, though a little bit controversial, Commodore in the South Carolina Navy. And as I said, he leases a ship from Luxembourg. They aptly name it the South Carolina. And the South Carolina is one of the more important ships of the Revolutionary War. However, the war ends, and the Prince of Luxembourg wants his money for the ship he leased, and he sends today's founder, John Brown Cutting, over back to his home of South Carolina to try and get money for the prince. Now, this doesn't go well. South Carolina doesn't have any money. This is also, I will note, before the Constitution comes into play and before Alexander Hamilton collects his Assumption Plan to collect all the state's debts together. And, well, Cutting is not able to get this money for the Prince of Luxembourg. And actually, this financial problem would haunt South Carolina for decades. For whatever reason, it doesn't seem to have been included in Hamilton's Assumption Plan once it comes through. I was unable to locate exactly why that is, but it does hamper South Carolina from growing and becoming... South Carolina grows like the rest of the states do, I should say that, but it does hamper their ability to do so, trying to pay back this one really important ship to the Revolutionary War. Now, Cutting goes back after just a year in South Carolina. He goes back to Europe, and while he's there, he begins engaging in an attempt to help free soldiers in British custody. Now, the British never stopped impressing soldiers, and just to remind you, impressment is when you capture a sailor on another ship, put them on your ship, put them in your uniform, and say you're fighting for us now. And this was a fairly common practice. In fact, it would lead to the War of 1812, just 30, 40 years after the American Revolution. One of the leading causes of that war was the impressment of soldiers. It was also a cause of the Revolutionary War, but not on the top of the laundry list of complaints. Now, there were over 1,000 American soldiers essentially being imprisoned into the British Navy. And Cutting does his best to liberate these soldiers from their situation. And he does this pretty much at his own expense. Now, he returns to the United States not long after this, both practicing law and seeking reimbursement from the federal government. I mean, these are technically American sailors he just freed, and his old, I don't want to say buddy, but boss, John Adams, had become president by this point. Now, Cutting does receive $2,000 for his troubles, and that is a lot of money for the time. However, it's not the most money in the world, especially when he spent a lot more than that securing the freedom of these American sailors. Unfortunately, he spends the next decade or so, the remainder of his life, trying to recoup this money unsuccessfully, but living back home in America, acting as a lawyer. And that is the story of John Brown Cutter, John Brown Cutting, who is an American founder. I hope you learned a little bit. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this, definitely hit like and subscribe for American Revolution all week long.